Most people misunderstand what happens when an empath finally becomes silent. They assume the silence is anger, punishment, or a temporary reaction designed to get attention. In reality, the silence of an empath is often one of the loudest messages they will ever send. It does not arrive suddenly. It is built over weeks, months, and sometimes years of trying to communicate feelings that seem to fall on deaf ears. An empath is naturally inclined to understand, forgive, and search for solutions. They are willing to have difficult conversations. They are willing to explain their emotions repeatedly. They are willing to give second chances, third chances, and sometimes far more than that. Because of this pattern, avoidant individuals often become accustomed to the empath always returning to the conversation. The avoidant develops an unconscious expectation. No matter how distant they become, no matter how many messages they leave unanswered, and no matter how often they withdraw emotionally, the empath will eventually reach out again. The empath becomes a predictable source of emotional energy. They keep the connection alive, even when they are receiving very little in return. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant never fully experiences the consequences of emotional withdrawal. Every time the distance grows, the empath bridges the gap. Every time communication breaks down, the empath attempts to repair it. Over time, the avoidant begins to view this effort as normal. What they fail to recognize is that every unanswered need leaves a mark. Every dismissed feeling creates another layer of emotional exhaustion. Empaths do not stop caring overnight. They slowly reach a point where their emotional resources become depleted. They realize that understanding someone does not guarantee being understood in return. They discover that compassion alone cannot sustain a relationship. Eventually, they reach a moment where continuing to fight for the connection feels more painful than letting go of it. This is where the silence begins. It is not dramatic, it is not announced, there is no final warning. The empath simply stops investing energy where it is no longer valued. For the avoidant, this shift can be confusing at first. They may enjoy the extra space. They may interpret the silence as independence, or assume the empath is merely taking time to cool down. But as the days pass, something unexpected happens. The emotional signals they have always received disappear. There are no more attempts to reconnect. No more emotional check-ins. No more efforts to understand their behavior. The person who once brought warmth, patience, and emotional consistency is suddenly absent. At first, the avoidant may not consciously notice what is missing. Yet beneath the surface, a sense of unease begins to grow. Human beings adapt quickly to support systems. Even when they claim not to need them, they become accustomed to their presence. The empath's silence removes something the avoidant relied on without realizing it. The relationship no longer revolves around the avoidant's comfort. The emotional safety net is gone. The constant reassurance is gone. The person who continuously made room for their fears and insecurities is no longer doing the work. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone with the emotional reality they spent so much time avoiding. That is why the silence becomes so powerful. It is not the absence of words that affects them. It is the absence of certainty. The avoidant suddenly realizes that the empath may not return this time. The familiar cycle has been interrupted. The person who always reached back has stopped reaching. The silence forces them to confront a possibility they never considered, that someone who cared deeply has finally decided to stop carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection. In that moment, the silence says more than any argument ever could. One of the most misunderstood realities about empaths is that they rarely leave the moment they are hurt. Most people imagine a dramatic breakup, a heated argument, or a sudden decision. The truth is often far quieter. An empath usually begins leaving emotionally long before they leave physically. Their departure is not a reaction to a single event. It is the result of a long internal process that develops after repeated disappointment, emotional neglect, and unmet needs. This is especially important when dealing with avoidant individuals because avoidants often focus on visible actions while missing the invisible emotional shifts happening beneath the surface. An empath's natural instinct is to preserve connection. They want understanding, harmony, and emotional closeness. When problems arise, they do not immediately walk away. Instead, they try to communicate. They explain their feelings. They search for solutions. They offer patience and compassion even when they are struggling themselves. Because they value emotional bonds so deeply, they often stay in difficult situations longer than most people would. They continue investing energy because they believe that genuine effort can heal misunderstandings and strengthen relationships. What many avoidants fail to recognize is that every attempt an empath makes represents another opportunity being offered. Every conversation about feelings is a request for connection. Every expression of pain is an invitation to work together. Every act of forgiveness is a decision to continue believing in the relationship. While the avoidant may see these moments as ordinary, the empath experiences them as significant emotional investments. Each one requires vulnerability, hope, and trust. Over time, however, a pattern can emerge. The empath speaks, but nothing changes. The empath explains, but their words are minimized or ignored. The empath reaches out, but the response remains distant. Gradually, something begins to shift inside them. They still care deeply, but they start questioning whether their emotional efforts are making any difference. They begin noticing that they are carrying responsibilities that should be shared. They realize that understanding another person's fears does not excuse being consistently hurt by them. This realization rarely creates immediate detachment. Instead, it creates emotional fatigue. The empath becomes tired of repeating the same conversations. They become exhausted from trying to decode mixed signals and inconsistent behavior. The emotional energy they once poured into the relationship starts to decrease. They may still be physically present. They may still answer messages and participate in daily interactions. To an outside observer, everything may appear normal. Yet internally, an important transformation is taking place. The empath starts protecting their heart. They lower their expectations. They stop imagining the future they once hoped for. They become less invested in outcomes that previously mattered deeply. Their emotional world begins shifting away from the relationship and back toward themselves. This process can take months or even years, depending on the depth of the connection and the empath's capacity for patience. The avoidant often remains unaware of this change because the empath does not always announce it. They are not seeking revenge or trying to create fear. In many cases, they simply become quieter. The emotional intensity that once fueled the relationship begins fading. The questions stop. The requests for reassurance become less frequent. The attempts to repair every conflict disappear. What the avoidant sees as peace is often emotional withdrawal already in progress. By the time the empath finally decides to leave, the decision may appear sudden to everyone else. The avoidant may feel shocked and confused. They may wonder why the empath did not give them more warning. Yet the warning existed all along. It was present in every conversation that went nowhere, every need that remained unmet, and every effort that received little response. The empath had been signaling their pain for a long time. The difference is that they eventually stop believing those signals would be heard. When they finally walk away, they are not beginning the process of letting go. They are completing a process that started long before anyone noticed. One of the biggest reasons avoidants experience such a profound collapse after an empath becomes silent is because they mistake patience for permanence. They become so accustomed to the empath's loyalty, understanding, and willingness to stay that they begin treating those qualities as guaranteed. What starts as appreciation slowly transforms into expectation. The empath continues showing up after arguments, continues offering understanding after emotional distance, and continues extending grace when others might have already walked away. Because this pattern repeats itself over and over, the avoidant begins to assume it will never end. Human beings naturally adapt to what is consistently available. When something valuable is always present, its importance can become invisible. The avoidant grows comfortable knowing that no matter how much distance they create, the empath will likely remain connected. If they pull away emotionally, the empath reaches out. If they become cold or detached, the empath tries to understand the reasons behind the behavior. If conflict arises, the empath often becomes the one working hardest to restore peace. These repeated experiences teach the avoidant a dangerous lesson. The relationship will survive regardless of how much effort they contribute. The problem is that patience is not an unlimited resource. While empaths are known for their compassion and resilience, they are still human beings with emotional limits. Every act of understanding requires energy. Every act of forgiveness requires emotional strength. Every decision to stay despite disappointment carries a psychological cost. The empath may absorb these costs quietly for a long time, but that does not mean they are unaffected by them. Beneath the surface, emotional exhaustion slowly accumulates. Avoidants often fail to notice this accumulation because empaths rarely make dramatic demands. Instead of issuing ultimatums, they keep trying. Instead of threatening to leave, they search for deeper understanding. Their commitment can create the illusion that they are incapable of walking away. The avoidant starts viewing the empath's loyalty as part of their identity rather than as a choice being made every day. This is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Loyalty is a decision, not a permanent condition. Patience is an expression of care, not proof of endless tolerance. Every time the empath chooses to stay, they are making a conscious investment in the relationship. Yet when those investments consistently produce little return, the emotional equation begins to change. The empath starts recognizing that love alone cannot sustain a connection that lacks mutual effort. They realize that compassion should not require self-abandonment. As this awareness grows, the empath slowly reclaims emotional energy that was previously dedicated to maintaining the relationship. They become less willing to excuse behaviors that repeatedly hurt them. They stop assuming that understanding someone's wounds means accepting the consequences of those wounds forever. They begin developing stronger boundaries, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. This transformation often happens quietly, making it difficult for the avoidant to recognize. Because the avoidant has mistaken patience for permanence, they continue operating as though nothing fundamental has changed. They believe there will always be another conversation, another opportunity, another chance to reconnect later. The empath's presence has become so familiar that its loss feels impossible. They assume that no matter how distant they become, the empath's loyalty will compensate for the imbalance. Then the moment arrives when the empath stops compensating. The endless understanding disappears, the emotional chasing ends, the willingness to carry the relationship alone fades away. For the avoidant, this feels sudden and shocking because they never saw patience as something that could expire. They believed the empath's devotion was permanent rather than conditional upon mutual care and respect. The silence that follows becomes deeply unsettling. The avoidant begins realizing that what they assumed would always be available is no longer there. The person who consistently offered emotional safety has stopped offering it. The connection they believed was guaranteed now feels uncertain. In that moment, they are forced to confront a reality they spent years overlooking. The empath never stayed because they had to stay. They stayed because they chose to. Once that choice changes, the avoidant discovers how fragile certainty can be when it was built upon assumptions rather than appreciation. One of the most powerful psychological shifts that occurs when an empath becomes silent is the sudden loss of emotional validation that an avoidant has quietly relied upon for years. Many people assume that avoidants do not need emotional connection because they appear independent, distant, or self-sufficient. They often present themselves as people who are comfortable handling everything alone. They may avoid vulnerable conversations, withdraw during conflict, and minimize the importance of emotional needs. From the outside, it can seem as though they are completely unaffected by the presence or absence of emotional support. But beneath that image exists a different reality. Every human being needs validation. Every human being wants to feel understood, accepted, and emotionally significant to someone. The difference is that avoidants often struggle to acknowledge these needs openly. Instead of expressing their desire for connection directly, they develop strategies that allow them to maintain emotional distance while still benefiting from the presence of caring people. In many relationships, the empath becomes the person providing this emotional support. They listen carefully, offer reassurance, and create a space where the avoidant feels accepted despite their fears and imperfections. Over time, this support becomes a normal part of the avoidant's emotional environment. They may not consciously recognize how much they depend on it, but they grow accustomed to knowing it exists. The empath becomes the person who checks in, understands hidden emotions, notices subtle changes in mood, and continues caring even when communication becomes difficult. This creates a source of emotional stability that the avoidant rarely acknowledges because it is always available. The problem with unconscious dependence is that people often fail to appreciate something until it disappears. As long as the empath remains present, the avoidant can continue believing that they do not need emotional support. They can maintain the illusion of complete independence because someone else is quietly providing emotional consistency behind the scenes. The empath acts as a stabilizing force, absorbing tension, offering understanding, and maintaining connection even during periods of emotional withdrawal. When the empath finally becomes silent, that stabilizing force vanishes. At first, the avoidant may experience relief. The pressure to communicate disappears. The expectation of emotional engagement is gone. There are no difficult conversations waiting to happen. The silence creates more space, which is often something avoidants believe they want. Yet as time passes, a different emotional experience begins to emerge. The absence of validation starts creating a void. The messages that once provided reassurance no longer arrive. The emotional warmth that once softened difficult days is missing. The sense of being understood by someone who genuinely cared begins fading from daily life. Even if the avoidant cannot immediately identify what is wrong, they start feeling the effects of that absence. Small moments become reminders of what has been lost. Situations that once felt manageable now feel heavier. Achievements feel less satisfying when there is no one emotionally invested in celebrating them. Challenges feel more isolating when there is no empath quietly offering support. This is where the psychological impact deepens. The avoidant begins recognizing that the empath contributed far more to their emotional well-being than they ever admitted. The connection was not merely convenient, it was meaningful. The validation they received was not insignificant. It was helping them feel grounded, valued, and understood. Without it, emotional loneliness becomes more visible. The silence forces the avoidant into direct contact with feelings they previously avoided. They can no longer rely on the empath to provide comfort while maintaining emotional distance themselves. The relationship's emotional energy has been removed from the equation. What remains is a growing awareness of absence. The person who once offered endless understanding is no longer there to interpret their silence, excuse their behavior, or reassure them of their worth. As that realization grows, the avoidant begins confronting an uncomfortable truth. The emotional validation they assumed would always be available was never guaranteed. It was a gift provided by someone who cared deeply. Once that gift is withdrawn, the emptiness it leaves behind becomes impossible to ignore, and the silence that seemed insignificant at first transforms into a powerful reminder of everything the empath was contributing all along. One of the deepest reasons avoidants struggle after pushing an empath into silence is that they suddenly lose the sense of control they once believed they had. Many avoidants do not seek control in obvious ways. They are not always manipulative, demanding, or intentionally hurtful. Instead, their control often comes through distance. They manage emotional situations by deciding how close people can get, when conversations happen, and how much vulnerability they are willing to reveal. Creating space becomes a method of maintaining safety. The less emotionally exposed they feel, the more secure they believe they are. For a long time, this strategy appears to work. When an empath is involved, the avoidant learns that emotional distance rarely results in permanent consequences. If they withdraw, the empath usually reaches out. If they become silent, the empath often tries to understand what is wrong. If conflict arises, the empath frequently takes the first step toward resolution. This pattern allows the avoidant to remain in a position where they can control the level of emotional engagement without risking the complete loss of the relationship. The empath unknowingly supports this dynamic through their compassion. They understand that people have fears, wounds, and insecurities. Rather than interpreting distance as rejection, they often view it as a sign of pain. Because of this perspective, they continue offering patience and understanding. They make excuses for behaviors that leave them emotionally neglected. They believe that enough love, empathy, and consistency will eventually create safety for the avoidant. What the avoidant does not realize is that this arrangement only continues because the empath chooses to sustain it. The apparent control is not actually based on power, it is based on the empath's willingness to keep investing in the relationship despite the imbalance. The moment that willingness begins to fade, the foundation of the dynamic starts to weaken. When the empath finally becomes silent, something unexpected happens. The avoidant discovers that the emotional distance they once used as protection no longer gives them control. Instead, it leaves them powerless. They can no longer rely on the familiar cycle. The empath is not chasing, questioning, or attempting to repair the connection. The usual responses are gone. For the first time, the avoidant is forced to sit with uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable because it removes predictability. The avoidant no longer knows what the empath is thinking, feeling, or planning. They can no longer assume that the relationship will automatically survive another period of withdrawal. The silence introduces consequences that cannot be managed through distance alone. Every day without contact becomes a reminder that the connection is no longer operating according to the old rules. As this reality settles in, the avoidant begins confronting emotions they have spent years avoiding. Regret starts replacing confidence. Questions replace assumptions. The belief that there would always be another opportunity begins to weaken. They start recognizing that their emotional strategy may have protected them from vulnerability, but it also prevented genuine closeness. The empath's silence acts like a mirror. It reflects the true state of the relationship without excuses or distractions. There is no longer anyone working overtime to maintain harmony. There is no longer anyone carrying the emotional weight for both people. What remains is the reality of the choices that were made and the opportunities that were missed. In that space, the avoidant can no longer hide behind distance. They are left facing the consequences of their actions, and that loss of control often becomes one of the most unsettling experiences they have ever encountered. The final reason avoidants often collapse after pushing an empath into silence has less to do with rejection and more to do with regret. Many people assume that the pain comes from losing access to a relationship, but the deeper wound is often the realization of what was lost. Rejection can be rationalized. People can tell themselves that the relationship was not right, that circumstances got in the way, or that separation was inevitable. Regret is different. Regret forces a person to look backward and recognize that things could have been different if they had acted differently. For a long time, avoidants may believe they have time. They assume the empath will continue showing patience, continue offering understanding, and continue making room for their fears and emotional distance. Because the empath remains present through difficult periods, the avoidant begins viewing that presence as something stable and permanent. They tell themselves there will always be another opportunity to communicate better, another chance to become more vulnerable, and another moment to express appreciation. The future feels open, and because it feels open, action is postponed. The empath, however, is undergoing a very different experience. While they continue offering care, they are also keeping track of emotional reality. They notice when effort is one-sided. They notice when their needs are repeatedly overlooked. They notice when understanding is expected from them, but rarely returned. Eventually, there comes a point when they stop waiting for change and start accepting what the relationship has become. When the empath falls silent, the avoidant often assumes it is temporary. They expect the familiar cycle to repeat itself. Days pass, then weeks. The expected message never arrives. The attempts to reconnect never come. Slowly, the avoidant realizes that something has fundamentally changed. This is when regret begins to emerge. The regret is not simply about losing attention. It is about losing someone who genuinely cared. Empaths offer a rare kind of connection. They try to understand what others are feeling beneath the surface. They remain supportive during difficult moments. They often see potential in people long before those people see it in themselves. When that kind of presence disappears, the loss becomes difficult to replace. The avoidant starts replaying conversations, decisions, and missed opportunities. They remember moments when they could have opened up but chose silence. They recall times when they could have shown appreciation, but assumed there would be another chance later. The mind begins connecting pieces that were previously ignored. Patterns become visible. Consequences become undeniable. What makes this experience so powerful is that the empath's silence communicates a truth words never could. It signals that the person who once fought for the connection has finally stopped fighting. The one who repeatedly chose understanding has chosen themselves instead. In that realization, the avoidant is left facing not just the absence of the empath, but the weight of knowing that a rare and meaningful connection slipped away because it was never fully valued while it was still there.